We are in Romans chapter 3. I'm going to start reading to you there from verse number 27. Where then is the boasting? New International Version of the Bible. It is excluded because of what law? The law that requires works? No, because of the law that requires faith. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God a God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles too? Yes, of the Gentiles too, since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? If, in fact, Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the one who does not work, but trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then he is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is also the father, he's also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but also follow in their footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be the heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who depend on the law are heirs, faith means nothing, and the promise is worthless. Because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. I'm going to stop reading there. I think that's probably sufficient for a while. In the Bible, you'll find several words translated into English for what the sacrifice is meant to accomplish, what it is actually supposed to get done. One of those words is expiation. You run across that, especially in King James, every now and again. The other is propitiation, and propitiation, it means one thing, and expiation means another. They both basically are getting to the ultimate same ends, but from slightly different perspectives. So when you see propitiation being talked about, it's talking about reconciliation. So when it talks about Jesus' blood being offered as a redemption, a propitiation for God, what it means is that that blood was the means by which God and the believer can be reconciled, can come into a right relationship with one another. And then expiation talks about a compensation for wrong. And so, that would be something similar to getting a fine. If you have a fine, it's because there was some law or some regulation that was broken, and in order to put things right, some kind of compensation has got to be made for the wrong that was done. And so that's what the word expiation concentrates on, the compensation for the wrong. And you'll see sometimes, now in the Greek there's a couple different words used to translate these words, hence you see two different words in English often used. But where expiation is used, the flavor in talking about Christ's redemption and the forgiveness in his sacrifice, it's really talking about, whenever you see expiation, it's talking about the fact that his blood paid a ransom. His blood was the price that was due. There was a fine on all the sinners, if you will. That fine was death. And so the price of sin is death. Jesus paid that price in his blood. So that's what expiation is all about. When you see propitiation talked about, that's talking about the fact that what Jesus did brought us and the Father back together. We're not separated any longer. We're not at odds with each other. We're not unfriendly, but we have become friendly. And so both of those aspects fit into, you can look at the redemption of Christ from either perspective. They both get to a really good place. But either thing is often talked about. Sometimes they're both talked about together, like in some of the cases that we saw here in Romans chapter 3. Even if they don't say expiation and propitiation. In fact, the one in this section just says basically propitiation. But it describes in the ransom of the blood, expiation, right almost in the same breath. And so you have both of those concepts put together. So when Jesus died on the cross, what did he do? He paid the price for our sin, and by doing so, he brought us back together with God. Now, sometimes you'll see the word atonement used to describe that particular aspect, propitiation. But, those words are important to remember as you read not only through the book of Romans, but throughout the New Testament. And even into the Old Testament, these concepts reach back and kind of are shadowed in the sacrificial system that was put into effect under Moses. And these are the two sides of the coin, if you will, of redemption. The price that needs to be paid for the wrong that was done, and the reconciliation of the parties. The bringing back to a right relationship, to a friendship, to being allies, to being in the same camp. A number of different ways you can look at it, all basically meaning the same thing. So just wanted to make sure that we touched on that. All of this is through the shedding of his blood, and which is received by faith. It tells us there, that weird kind of passage I was reading to you tonight, and it started my reading, where it's like you see that God demonstrates that he's righteous, and this, that, and the other thing. You think, what are you talking about, Paul? What's going on there? Because that really does not come off well. It's kind of something that you have to sit down and think about as you read it. So here's a little bit of analysis, hopefully, to help us with that. When it says that God proves or demonstrates, and the word that's translated in the NIV, demonstrates there, it basically is something that is proven, almost like if you did if you were selling Tupperware, and I understand that they don't have Tupperware parties really much anymore, or door-to-door things of that nature. But when those kinds of sales were common in America, what they would do, whether they were selling vacuum cleaners or Tupperware or knives or whatever else it would be, they would get out the product right in front of you, right? And they would demonstrate it. They would prove that it was worth you, putting out your hard-earned money to buy the certain thing. And so that's what this is talking about. God has proved his righteousness through the gospel, and he's done so in two ways that the text tells us about here in this section. And one of those ways, it points to the past, and it says that God's righteousness in the gospel. We understand what the gospel is, right? That's Jesus died on the cross for our sins, was raised from the dead. Those who believe in him, having done those things, and being who he is, will be saved. They will be forgiven of their sins and pronounced righteous by God. So that's the gospel. God proves his righteousness in the gospel, because some people think, and I think that was some of the argument that Paul was dealing with here, is that when you talk about the nature of the gospel, it seems like it's too good to be true. It seems like maybe there's something happening, kind of under the table, something up the sleeve. It just seems like somehow or another you're promising people through the gospel something that they don't have to work for, something they don't have to earn, something they never could. And, for some people, when they hear those kinds of claims that are associated with the gospel, they just think, how in the world is a righteous God going to be righteous and do something like that? And so Paul is kind of dealing with that kind of an argument. And maybe you've heard that argument before from someone. And he does it by looking at the past and looking at the present in his time, not in our time. In the past, he said that God is demonstrating his righteousness in the gospel because he overlooked the sins that were done before. There is some question about what he's talking about here, because we know that the basic theme that we've identified in the book of Romans is Jews and Gentiles in the gospel. There was a lot of issues, right, between the Jews and the Gentiles in the Roman church. And not just there. I mean, they came out in other places too, like the churches in Galatia. There was problems even in Jerusalem, amongst Jews and Gentiles in the church, being treated fairly, being treated equally, having unhindered fellowship. I mean, all of those kinds of things. And so there is some question when he says that God overlooked the sins that were committed before, and he uses a past perfect participle here. So he's talking about things that were finished in the past. So there's no lingering after effect of them or anything else like that. So this is something definitely located in what's behind, in the past. But in talking about that, you have to wonder, whose sins is he talking about? Now, I think probably the best reading is to see that he's probably putting a slight dig on the Jews for this. Because that's been kind of the flavor of the argument through chapter 3, right? Chapter 2, he started taking up the biggest issues that he saw between Jews and Gentiles was that it seems to me that he saw that Jews were not welcoming, not accepting of Gentiles. And so he's been trying to take apart all of those kinds of thoughts between, really starting with depth in chapter 2, now moving into chapter 3, and then into chapter 4, we'll see it as well. So I think he's probably talking about the Jews here, even if he didn't specify it. It seems to me like that fits the context. It's the thing that he's been talking about. It's a good reading, it seems to me, to take something that's kind of shorthanded and saying the sins that were committed before. So if that's the case, if he's talking about the Jews in particular here, then what he's saying is that the Jews had the law, but what was his charge against the Jews in chapter 2 and 3? They didn't keep the law. So if you have the law, but you don't keep the law, what's the result of that? Judgment, right? Wrath. So that's what should have happened to the Jews, right? They had the law, they didn't keep the law. The result of that should have been that God should have just, hauled off and knocked them one. Now, that did happen several times in their history, but not to the extent that we think of the way that sin actually gets judged. Sin gets judged when all is said and done in a very final kind of way. And so, if this is talking about the Jews, what it's referring to is that God didn't destroy them utterly. Though their sins deserved it, though under the law they would have been deserving of it, God did not treat them that way. He overlooked it. And that's really the flavor of when it says forbearing with sins in the past, overlooking. Different English translations will use some flavor of that kind of family of words. But basically that's what it's meaning, is that God had every right to act, but he didn't. God could have justifiably did something final, very judgmental, very wrathful, but he didn't. The Jewish people were preserved, even if they went through periods of culling. The Jewish people as a whole were preserved, and to the day of Paul, they were still there, still in the Promised Land. And so, this is what he would be talking about. Now, he also, in that same point of argument, made a very clear case, right, that the Jews and the Gentiles were in the same boat. He said that the Gentiles sin without the law, they're sinners. The Jews sin with the law, they're sinners. Everybody's a sinner. So he's making that argument throughout this space in the Bible. So, you can also take this to mean that he's talking about the way that God forbore or overlooked the sinfulness of the Gentiles. They didn't have the law, it didn't mean that they weren't sinners. And yet the human race was continuing on. So, which way did Paul actually mean? However you want to see, to tell you the truth. I think that you could read it either way and be good with the text. And I don't think that either reading changes ultimately that much about what's being said. So if you prefer to see it as something that's pointed at the Jews, that works. If you prefer to see it as something pointing to the Jews and Gentiles, hey, guess what? That works too. So either way that you look at it, it's good. Now, in the present, he says that God is revealing his righteousness in the gospel because all sins, everybody sins, Jews and Gentiles, all sin is being paid for. Now, in the past, he overlooked sin. There's this sense that God coulda, woulda, shoulda done something judgmental with sin, but he didn't. But in the present, what has he done? He has brought all sin to judgment. We like to say in the church world, right? All sin is being judged, right? You're either going to see your sin judged in Christ by faith, or you're going to be judged for your sin at the end of time. But all sin is being judged judged ultimately. And the thing that Jesus did is that he gave the entire world, every single person, an opportunity to see their sin judged in his work on the cross so that they wouldn't have to bear that judgment themselves in a time to come at the time of judgment. And so this is how God demonstrates his righteousness in the gospel, is that everything that has to do with God's judgment toward sin is brought to a head at the cross. Jesus took all of our sin upon himself there, and Jesus, with that sin upon him, fully took in himself the punishment due that sin. So the cost of sin was fully paid for by the sinless sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And so, is God being a softy? Are people getting off lightly? Is God winking at sin? No, none of those things are true. God's righteous. It's just that he has, in his graciousness, provided a means by which the brunt of that punishment can fall on someone other than those deserving through the auspices of a sacrifice, in this case, the sacrifice of Christ. So even though that's kind of a confusing paragraph, that's basically what he's getting to, is that there's nothing fishy about the gospel. It's not a sleight of hand thing. It's not playing fast and loose with the facts. It's, none of those things. God, in his white-hot fury towards sin, did act in his white-hot fury towards sin. He just put all of that sin on Christ and let all of his fury be poured out there. All right, so what does that mean? And you see here that the underlying question, I think, in that area is that righteousness, if God is truly righteous, it demands that sin get its just deserts. So sin has got to be dealt with. Sin has got to pay the price that sin has incurred. That's what righteousness is all about, especially from the judge. Now, when you think about all of this, boasting is excluded, and he talks about the law of faith as opposed to law. Again, it's just some of the clunkiness of how the Apostle Paul expresses things. Was he actually talking about here? He's talking about the fact that when it comes to the issue of faith, faith is not something that ever provides a means for anyone to boast. This is very important when you talk about, for instance, the difference between a Calvinist and a non-Calvinist soteriology about the grace of God and who gets the glory. A Calvinist theology would look at the fact that faith is purported by the non-Calvinist as being something that people are responsible to respond to the gospel with. If that is in their mind, if that is the way that it works out, well, then your faith is a work that gets rewarded with salvation. Right here, Paul starts talking about this subject matter in depth. By the time he gets done talking about this subject matter, a couple of things will be evident. Number one, faith is not considered a work. Faith is not considered a work in the sense that, a work is something that you do to accomplish something. What is faith? Faith is a response. It's a reaction. It's not a work. A work is something that you intentionally do, and the doing of it accomplishes something. You made something, you have a record, whatever it might be. That is what a work is. Faith, on the other hand, is seeing something done by someone else and saying yes or no to it. So faith is never treated, particularly in the book of Romans, as it is anything close to being something that could be called a work. In fact, the language is always oppositional. These things are opposites. These things are set always out as something that are things that are diametrically opposed. There is works of the law, and there's faith in Christ. They're not at all the same kind of thing. And so I think the Bible is very clear on the subject matter. There is no way that any theologian, any Bible teacher at all could ever make the claim that somehow or another faith is a work, because the Bible most clearly says that it's not. It's not a work at all. So this is kind of the thing that he's trying to get to in this particular part. He says that sinners are justified in this segment and dealing with it. Sinners are justified by faith. It's the means through which this happens. So when we talk about the shedding of blood, providing redemption, and it says that this comes through faith, and it says it a couple of times in those last 10 verses or so. What's it saying? Well, it's saying that faith is the way that something that is apart from you, something that you didn't do, something that you didn't develop, something that you didn't invent, something that you didn't bring forth, something apart from you. It's the way that something apart from you ends up having an effect on you. Faith is the means by which whatever it does gets into you. So, it's like that if you can think about we're seeing this terrible war go on in the Ukraine, one of those power plants would go up in a terrible nuclear explosion, right? You can see the big fireball from a distance. What's the means by which what's going on over there gets into you? It's through the eyes. You just happen to be taking it in, so to speak. And that is really kind of a flavor that we have for what faith does. Faith is the instrumentality of the soul that takes in something that God has done at some distance. Distance in time and distance in space for most people, right? Because we weren't in Jerusalem at the time, but it comes to us, it enters into us, it affects us, it comes to impact us through the auspices of faith. This whole thing that he is talking about here is actually upholding the law. There was a lot of pushback from Jewish Christians in the early days of the church that somehow or another the gospel was undermining, the law. They had such a long-standing commitment to the law, a long-standing heritage, and their culture was all wrapped up in the law, and to have someone like, particularly the Apostle Paul, because I think he was probably the most forceful, learned, eloquent of those speakers that were speaking about the subject matter, and one who was doing so with great authority. They just always kind of felt like he was being disloyal to the Jewish, to the Jewish heritage. You're pulling the rug out from under the beauty and the fact that the law was given by God Himself to Moses, to the Jewish people. And so, there's always this kind of underlying thing that goes between Paul and the rest of his Jewish mates in the sense that they think that somehow or another the gospel is a bomb that's blowing up the law. And here Paul makes this outrageous claim, right? He says that, no, this gospel of grace, that you get saved, you get credited with righteousness, which he develops here in the next chapter very strongly, that you get credited with righteousness through faith in what Jesus has done and who Jesus is. He says that actually doesn't undermine the law. That actually upholds the law. It's not tearing it down, it's upholding it. Now, there's a little bit of logic to this, and let me see if we can unpack this for you today. When he says this, he's basically getting to this point, that the law doesn't have within it the power to do anything about fixing the condition of a sinner. Right? So what is the functionality of the law? Well, we've learned already, right, that the function of the law is to describe sin. We wouldn't know what sin was if it wasn't for the law. The law comes along, it describes it, and then, that's kind of like what you get intellectually from it. What you get spiritually from it is, when you try to abide by it, you find just how difficult it is to do that. It's like there's something inside you fighting with you about that kind of thing. So the law has one particular function, and that is to describe sin. Not just to describe it, but it also basically is the trigger through which judgment comes. Because when a person is a sinner, when a person is in sin, then the law invokes judgment upon them. You break the law, you're a lawbreaker, now judgment comes. So what the law does is it turns everyone into a sinner. And that's all the functionality it has. It can't do anything beyond that. So the law, is upheld in this respect. There's not a problem with everyone recognizing they are a sinner. The law can do that. The law does that really well. And so the law, in the gospel of Christ, the law is not undermined. It's not circumvented. It's not tossed aside. It's not displaced. It's just a question of dealing with what the law can do and what it can't do. What it does is it makes you a sinner. What it can't do is unmake you a sinner. Right? And that's the problem, isn't it? Because if all we had was the law, all that it would do was make everybody a sinner. And then what? Oh no, here comes the lake of fire. That's it. That's all that it has in its functionality. And if that's where God left it, the whole human race would be lost without hope. There would be no way to come out of this condition of being sinners, because that's what we are by nature, and that's what we are by choice. And that is everyone, which is what I think something Paul really developed well through chapter 3 and the first part of chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 3. Everybody's a sinner. And so the law puts people into this position where, now we all know that we're doomed. Oh well, may as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And that's about where the law would lead you. But God is not interested in that. God's not interested in leaving us in the condition of sin with no hope. He actually wants to redeem people. But he can't use the law to do that, because the law doesn't have the power in itself to do that. There's nothing in the law that redeems the sinner. The law tells you a lawbreaker. It doesn't make you a lawkeeper. Because if you've already broken the law, you're already defined by the law. So all the law can ever do is tell you that you're a lawbreaker. What do you do about lawbreakers that would like to be right with God? Well, if God doesn't do something outside of the law, nothing. And this is the whole point of what the gospel is trying to accomplish, is that if you want to redeem the sinner, you have to come with another means that doesn't depend on what sinners cannot do. What sinners cannot do is live sinlessly. What sinners cannot do is be right every time. What sinners cannot do is live a life on their own pleasing. Sinners can't do that. So you have to come up with something that sinners can do. Right? We don't have to come up with something. God did. Right? And that's something that he came up with, was to give us the opportunity to be credited with righteousness that we have not earned by the law, so that we can walk in a restored relationship with God. Now this gets really well developed in chapter 4 through several examples. And if it sounds a little out there right at this point in time, chapter 4 tries to bring out the fact that this is not a new idea. Right? It's not like God was going along and he decided to try something with the human race and came to a certain point in time where he said, this just isn't working. I better come up with plan B. And so, God comes to a certain point in time and he says, the law just isn't working anymore. My plan B is going to be, I'm going to send Christ, my own son, to the earth. He's going to die for the sinners and call them to put their trust in him, and I'll credit them with righteousness. That'll work. It's not like God was working things out as he went. And the reason that we know this is particularly the life of Abraham. Now, Abraham was not someone who was at the very beginning of time. He came after the flood. He came, in some respect, reachable to us even in our day in history. But he was far back enough for us to say that the whole notion that we talk about in the gospel was like a new thing, something that somebody grabbed out of the air because they didn't feel like being Jewish anymore. The gospel was not a newfangled device, anything like that. The gospel, in the sense that it is all about finding a way to credit people with righteousness, even though they're ungodly. Okay? So, where did that start from? Well, it started with Abraham, and that's what basically what all of chapter 4 works on. It uses Abraham as the example to explain why this isn't a new thing, why this isn't something Paul made up, why this is something that has history. It has history with God. And if you understand that history, then not only do you understand the law's place, but you understand your connection with Abraham, even though you're not Jewish. And the connection is rich and deep and helpful. And so that's what he does for the next several verses through chapter 4. Now, he starts off talking about that Abraham was not justified by works, but by faith. Here's the verses that he's referring to specifically in that area. Genesis chapter 15, God is interacting with Abram at that point in time, and God tells Abraham this outrageous promise about him being the father of many nations, and stars that can't be counted. And the Bible tells us, in commenting on this, simply something very, very simple but profound. It says that Abraham believed God, and God credited him with righteousness. And those two things are put side by side so you understand the connection to them. Abraham believed what God promised him. Abraham believed what God said. God said, this doesn't depend on you, Abraham. This is not about what you can do. This is not about what you bring to the table. This is not about what you can accomplish, if you really set your mind to it. This is not at all about you, Abraham. This is about me making a promise to you. And Abraham said, thanks. Man, I appreciate that. He believed him. And that simple response on the part of Abraham was sufficient for God to credit him with righteousness. Now, the whole notion of credit, because when something is reckoned, it means it's considered. It's not necessarily that it is so, but that it's being seen as if it was so. And that's exactly how it is with Abraham. Sometimes I think the way that we preach righteousness by faith almost has that kind of flavor. That righteousness, or that faith in some way or another, it obligates or forces the hand of God, or is just part of some kind of eternal truth that even God has to live by, that if that is if that is so, then righteousness follows. But that's really not the case. Abraham, in being reckoned or credited with righteousness, it's not saying that Abraham was righteous. It's not saying that by believing he was righteous. Because sometimes I think we do say that. Oh, I believe in God, that makes me righteous. Does it really? How do you feel about your mom or dad? How do you feel about your neighbor and your neighbor's stuff? Right? How are you treating your spouse? Bad enough than anyone? What's the point I'm trying to get to is that here's the truth, is that Abraham wasn't righteous. He wasn't. I mean, on the scale of things, he seems like he's the kind of guy that was a whole lot better than a lot of other people maybe, but maybe he wasn't as good as other people. What happened in Abraham's life did not happen because Abraham was righteous. God did not make promises to Abraham because he was righteous. God didn't make any kind of connections to Abraham because Abraham was righteous. It merely is that God stepped into his life, put something before him, and Abraham said, okay. I mean, it was just reaction, if you will. And it didn't make Abraham righteous. Faith doesn't make you righteous. Faith is something that God responds to the person who has it by saying to them, I know you're not all that you should be, not all that I would like you to be, but I'm going to look at you as if you were. That's what it means to be credited with righteousness. It's not that I am righteous. It's not that I am wonderful. It's just that God is choosing out of his grace to look at me that way. Which is, that's a very humbling thing. It's very humbling to think that the exact opposite about me is actually true. But in God's love and kindness, he's willing to look at me in a way I do not deserve to be looked at. Right? That's the deal with Abraham. He was reckoned. God considered him to be righteous because he believed in him. Not because he actually was righteous, but because of God's grace. Right? When we believe in Christ, when we believe as Abraham did in the promise of God, when we believe in the promise of God and we are justified, right, through believing, it's a gift by free grace. That's basically what Paul said in between verses 20 and 25 in chapter 3. It's as a gift by grace. Faith does not force the hand of God. Faith does not accomplish something that trumps every other thing concerning God and his treatment of us. Faith is not that kind of a thing. God's response to faith is not on the basis of merit. It's not on the basis of fiat, that somehow or another faith has a power over God. It doesn't. The reaction that God gives to faith is a reaction that is not earned. It's free. The Greek word doria is used there. It means gift. NIV translates freely there instead of gift, but the word itself, that's the quality that it's trying to convey, something that's given as a gift. And it's by grace, by God's kindness. So the reason that God looks on faith the way that he does is not that faith itself deserves anything. Faith can't wash away sins. Faith can't somehow or another erase the mind of God. Faith has no power over God. Faith does not make God in any sense obligated. Faith doesn't have power over God. So when God looks at faith the way that he looks at it and responds to faith the way that he does, he's not doing so because he has to. He's doing so because he's kind. He's doing so because in his kindness there is in his heart the desire to gift us, to do something totally undeserved, to put something into our lives that we did not earn. See, this is the remarkable teaching of the gospel. It's not that faith is a work, because works do obligate the person for whom something is being done. If you work for me, I'm obligated to pay you. And faith does not put God under obligation. What faith does is that, for whatever reason, it's the thing that God looks at favorably. And in his kindness, sees it as something that he will grant grace to. Which is, that's wild that that's the heart and soul of the gospel, but it is. That's what it's all about. And when we say that we're saved by grace through faith, this is what we mean. Right? Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, the famous passage of Scripture, there it is again. When we say that we're saved by faith, or by grace through faith, what we're saying is the kindness of God that saves us. Nothing else. It's just what it's what's in the heart of God. We were lost, we were separated, and in his heart, he loves us. He wants us with us, or with him. And so, out of the kindness that's in the heart of God, he finds a way, through faith, to bring his favor into our lives. And that favor results in us being credited with righteousness. Now, there has to be something that anchors that. We talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, and that actually ends up being the cross, right? Because this is received through a redemption in the blood of Christ. And so it's, there's an aspect to this that if it was just that aspect, the kindness of God, the heart of God, it would probably be something that we would waver over. But in attaching this into that tangible means of the cross, of the blood that was still there, it adds solidness to it. We saw on the cross what two sides of redemption there is: expiation and propitiation. In a matter of speaking, in the cross we have the thing that assuages our guilt and helps us have confidence in the kindness of God. It demonstrates, right, this is what we'll learn as we go on, right, that the love of God for us is revealed to us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died. And so what we see in the gospel is that it's all about the heart of God, hence grace. Now, I'm going to say this now and finish with this tonight, because this is something I think it's important for you at this point in time to carry with you in the rest of Romans. You need to understand something about grace. Okay? Grace is not a power. Grace is not a force. Because sometimes the way that we talk about grace in the New Testament world, right, we say so much as by grace or of grace, or if God grants me grace, and we think of all the ways that we use grace in those kinds of ways, and it almost seems like grace is mysterious thing kind of floating through the space, and when it gets to us, something is enervated, or energized, not enervated. Enervated would be the wrong thing, but something is energized through that grace touching us, and then something happens. That's not what grace is. Grace means kindness. And so when we talk about grace, particularly in the New Testament context, what we're always talking about is the heart of God. What's in the heart of God? Grace is all about the kindness of God. And it's not just that he's kind, but that he's joyfully so. And so, when we talk about grace being the means or the basis of our salvation, it's not looking for a mysterious power that, is working through the spaces. It picks maybe one person and goes past the next one, almost like a Passover angel, right? That's not it at all. Grace is what's in God's heart for the sinner, what's in God's heart for us, and that love that is so far beyond our understanding. I mean, we think about, when you think about the love that God has for you, does it ever just kind of leave you befuddled? It's like you kind of sit there in a pool and it's like, I don't understand this. It's like, thank you. I mean, it's about all that you can say in response to it. But that's what the grace of God is. So you're not talking about some kind of electrical, mysterious, spiritual force that's floating around, and when grace hits the right person, a reaction happens. That's not it. Grace is the heart of God. It's the love that's in the heart of God. And it's that love that's in his heart that drives everything in the gospel. And that's something I think you need to keep in mind, not only in the book of Romans, but throughout the New Testament.